Okay, the next term I want to talk about is threat vector and vulnerabilities, right? Threat vector is one of those ones, like I mentioned previously, makes you sound important when you start throwing those types of terms around. It sounds very ominous, the threat vector. But it's a path or a tool that a threat actor uses to attack the target, all right? So it's basically what a hacker uses. There's the path that they use or the tool that they use to initiate an attack on a target or on an asset. So it's also referred to as the attack vector. Okay, so a threat vector or the attack vector. So a target can be anything of value. It can be a computer system or a network. It can be a smartphone or a PDA. Of course, what's a PDA? I haven't used that term in years, but if you want a history lesson, you can look that up and get a little peek into the past. An iPad or a tablet, things along those lines. It could also be things like your personal identity. Okay, identity theft is an asset, obviously. So if someone can steal your identity and then either sell that or create fake credit cards or what have you, all of these things are potential targets for a hacker. So the goal isn't always necessarily to steal data. It could also be to destroy data, take a system down, just basically take a company offline. It could be a hacker by a competitor. It could be espionage from again, either a competitor or a hacker looking to just steal information and sell it to the highest bidder. It really just depends. All right, and then vulnerabilities are the errors or the bugs in code. Incorrectly configured software, firewalls, routers, access control lists, so on and so forth. So a vulnerability is anything that allows an attacker to basically penetrate our defenses. So again, it could be something that's really not through our own fault. It could be a bug or an error in our operating system or our, the OS on our router or firewall, something that we don't have direct control over. Or it could be something that is within our control that is incorrectly configured. So software on our firewalls, routers, ACLs, et cetera, et cetera. So vulnerabilities have to be looked at and approached from a variety of perspectives. You have to look at the actual software that we buy from our various vendors, and we also have to make sure that we appropriately address, patch, and update those pieces of infrastructure as well. Okay, so all the things we've talked about so far all really center around risk. So when it all is said and done, we need to understand the various ways that we can manage that risk. So there are multiple ways of managing risk, and that is basically either accepting certain levels, because undoubtedly, at the end of the day, you can't prevent absolutely everything. All right, so we have to accept certain levels of risk. We just have to understand and decide what that level is going to be. So we can implement controls to reduce as much as obviously as possible. Okay, reduce as much risk as possible, or we can avoid it altogether to a certain degree. We can avoid a specific risk altogether, but as I said, we can't avoid all risks. There's always going to be some type of risk introduced in our environment. So managing risk can be defined as the identification, the assessment, and the prioritization of risk, along with the mitigation and the monitoring of those risks. So what does that really mean? Well, when dealing with computer hardware and software, risk management is also known as information assurance. All right, we basically want to make sure that our information is protected. All right, it's confidential, the integrity, and available. Right, that CIA triad that I mentioned previously. And again, it's going to depend upon the company's risk tolerance or your company's risk tolerance, the industry that you're in. Are you a government entity or perhaps a tech startup? Okay, there's obviously a big disparity between the two. The value of the data. Do you have millions and millions of customers with valuable customer identification, credit cards, and so on and so forth? Or is it simply maybe just a blog on a website that you serve ads from? It obviously can vary, completely 180 degrees in different directions. And then also your ability to recover. So it really just boils down to a few concepts that you can use when you're developing your risk tolerance and your approach to managing. All right. So there's something referred to as risk transference, and that means transferring the risk to a third party. So in other words, we don't necessarily want to assume all of that risk ourselves. We're going to give some of it to a third party who signs up. They sign up maybe for SLAs or service level agreements. Okay, an example here would be a hosting provider. So we're going to take our servers, instead of having them internally on our network, we're going to have it hosted at a third-party location. So they're going to provide security around accessing firewalls, maintenance, so on and so forth. So if something does happen, if those servers are breached, they're going to assume some of that risk. Okay, they're going to be held liable in some fashion. Risk acceptance is, okay, what's the cost of removing the risk versus dealing with the issue if and when it occurs. So I mentioned earlier, if we're going to spend $1 million to remediate something, and the actual threat or the cost, if it actually were successfully hacked or penetrated, might be $30,000 or $40,000. Well, it's not worth spending $1 million to protect $30,000. All right, so we have to make sure we compare and contrast and look and say, okay, the risk is really not as great as the cost for protecting against that risk. Okay, quote unquote, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And then we have risk mitigation or deterrence. Okay, what level of reduction is acceptable? What controls can be put in place to effectively minimize the risk? So yes, we can put antivirus on everyone's computer, and that may be an acceptable, a fairly easy thing to do to give us antivirus protection. But no, we're not going to sit there and put a firewall in front of every single person's computer. We're not going to throw up some type of piece of hardware in front of everyone's computer and lock it down to the point where they can't do anything. So yes, you could put controls in place that make it virtually impossible to breach, but again, at what cost?